This graduate of Texas Tech University is a friend of the show. He's a former member of the Board of Regents for Texas Tech. He's a sixth-generation West Texan. He's the president and chief executive officer of the Texas Trucking Association, TXTA. He's going to tell us all about it. But Dave, why don't you say the name of the man, longtime friend of the show, joining us on the first State of Trucking on Nemo Nation. Take it away.
Our dear friend, longtime friend, John Esparza. John, good morning.
Woo!
Hey, good morning, guys. Glad to be here with you. And I'll tell you, on the heels of that history lesson from Les Paul, I happen to be in Lubbock, Texas today, and just a couple of streets over from the elementary school where Buddy Holly went to school, much less his hometown, but right here thinking about Les Paul and Buddy Holly.
Wow, that's incredible. You know, it's funny about about Buddy Holly. They misspelled his name on his first record, and he just left it that way.
How was it supposed to be spelled? Was it supposed to be spelled B-U-D-D-I-E? I'm kidding. I'm kidding. By the way. How was it supposed to be spelled?
I forget. How is it with the E or out the E? I'll have to look that up.
It's E-Y. It was originally E-Y, and they left the E out.
Yeah.
That's what really happened.
Right.
That's what went down. Hey, John, how you been, man? It's good to hear your voice.
Well, it's good to hear you guys. Excuse me. Speaking of that voice, I've been losing it. We ended a legislative session here in Texas just last week, and it was a grind. So I'm glad to be done with that, but ready to take on the rest of the year, frankly, when it comes to all things trucking.
Well, it's sort of like one of those just wait situations. One bill, and we're talking about tort reform now, and I know that was probably, if not the focus, certainly one of the top issues that you guys were talking about, the life and death of one bill, and then the rebirth of another bill. So we got enough bills here to, line our wallets, I guess you might say, if they were dollars. What is the situation on tort reform now? Is that too simple? Is that too simple a question at this point?
Well, it is not. It is something, we have been working on various tort reform measures for years. 4 years ago, passed what would be one of the biggest tort reform items for trucking in our state, most certainly ever, in House Bill 19. And what we learned about House Bill 19 this session is that it is working, and we have went through a process this session, and when we're looking at additional tort reform measures, the reality is the injustices in the civil justice system, the fraud that's been occurring in the civil justice system, especially in the state of Texas, has gotten worse. And when things get worse and people are profitable from it, they tend to work to protect that very hard. So we did have a couple other measures this session to address those. They were defeated. And when I mean defeated, if it says anything, we actually came down to a tie vote, which means that's not a defeat, actually. In the instance that it was used in state, it would have been a win, but in a verification vote, we lost that vote by 2 votes. And then to make things even worse, 2 members of the legislature asked to change their name in the journal on that vote later, but the vote had already occurred. So we were in a very, very tight effort this session, which only tells us that we just have more work to do to get this across the finish line for the next session in Texas.
John, you're in a unique position because there's a lot of people who have worked in the industry, and there's a lot of people who have worked in government, and there's a lot of people who've worked in politics. And as you know, they're not the same thing. There's some people who like to turn them into synonyms for one another. They're not. You really have an understanding about how the trucking industry works, but also an understanding of what is possible and what can kind of get done. And so you have a unique understanding as well that, as you're kind of pointing out here, that this doesn't happen overnight. Number one, there are no instant gratification moments except when you win something finally. It's like being an overnight success in music. It just took you 10 years to kind of get there. As this battle continues, because we're going to pivot to some stuff about the border here in a second, But as this kind of continues, where do you see your prospects? Are you still hopeful about the agenda you guys have in regards to tort reform and in regards to where stuff is headed next?
Oh, it's a great question, and I do. I am hopeful, and for this reason, what we're looking for is comprehensive reform that's really simple. What we're suggesting is that an informed jury is just simply a better jury, and we work to arm juries with market-based evidence regarding on the true value of medical services in this case. So what we're looking at in the terms of abuse is the inflated medical costs that are being perpetrated and put into these cases that are causing these nuclear verdicts, that are causing these overinflated verdicts that are basically taking a very, and this is just a piece of it now. You cannot put a cost on pain and suffering. You can't put well, this is what I think it is because someone will think it is different. But when we talk about just some very basic pieces of a civil trial and look at medical procedures and say what's being abused there is just the overinflated costs that are being put in front of juries and that they're actually claiming on. And that is the biggest piece of where we're seeing abuse that's gotten so out of hand that it is absolutely contributed to the skyrocketing prices of our insurance that's been on the rise over the years, and the proliferation of this practice has just gotten worse because we're continuing to see it more and more in Texas communities, and frankly, it's occurring all over the country and in pockets worse than others, but we're definitely one of the worst places in the country for it.
Final follow-up question, and then we'll get to some of the stuff we're going to talk about with the border. How are you guys able to make the communication leap? The idea that when people see higher prices at the diesel pump, just driving by, even though they don't put diesel in their own cars, they understand, oh, that's why my eggs cost more. Oh, that's why my goods and services cost more. How is the battle going with convincing the general public at large, hey man, insurance rates keep going up because of nuclear verdicts, all this stuff is being ultimately passed on to customers. This is another reason why, from y'all's perspective, at least you can tell me if I'm wrong, from y'all's perspective, what the case is for the kind of stuff that you guys are pushing in the Texas legislature.
Well, that's the precise battle. Things have to happen in a very political manner, at a grassroots level and a grass tops level. And when you are that far removed from the costs that are increasing, it's real easy to not make that connection. The U.S. Chamber back in April put out a data point, a study in which they looked at what is the rising costs of these nuclear verdicts, these rising costs of the multiple verdicts, not just the nuclear ones, but the ones that are $1 million and less. All these collectively, there's a cost for it, and it increases the cost of everything for everybody. In the state of Texas, from that study, the cost per household was $4,594 per household in the state of Texas for absorbing, if you will, all of the abuses that we're seeing in our courtrooms. So every individual is paying that price, and that's something that we have to continue to work from the public affairs, public relations standpoint to make people understand that here's what it's costing you and here's what we can do about it.
We're going to pivot now because we could spend all morning on this, but this is really kind of crucial too. In regards to the border, and I don't mean the actual movement and flow across the border, we'll get to that in a second, but in regards to dealing with the Mexican government and its issuance of CDLs, this is a really contentious point, and you guys are doing your best to kind of work with the Texas government and the federal government to kind of issue some changes out there about issuance, correct? Am I understanding that correctly?
That is correct. We have had and seen issues, with the introduction of Mexican CDLs in our state that are fraudulently being issued, and that has been going on for a number of years. Our law enforcement community recognized that firsthand, and we worked with them 2 years ago to pass legislation that effectively says this: if you're going to hand me a Mexican CDL, and because of the fraud involved in it, you as a law enforcement community are now running that CDL, and it comes back as valid. Well, now in Texas, you can also, enforcement-wise, ask for the B-1 visa, the appropriate worker authorization to accompany that license, so that that law enforcement officer has an idea of whether that is a truly valid CDL that they're being handed. And they've been having their suspicions about it, and it took work to understand what was happening roadside, and the reason why we passed that legislation 2 years ago, so that we can help ourselves in the state of Texas.
So let me do a quick follow-up for that, too, because that, in many ways, opens the door for all kinds of problems, because with the issuance of those kind of CDLs, it's not just a matter of people who may not be safe on the road, but some really dangerous people might actually be behind some of those CDLs as well, too. Is there, and by the way, there's a cartel connection in other places, but are you guys worried about the criminal element that's attached to the CDLs as well?
Well, absolutely, and that was the catalyst behind it. It's the nefarious activity behind the issuance of those CDLs and their growth in the state of Texas, and not just in the Mexican side of things, but also abuse with third-party providers, the availability of these at flea markets. There is a documented abuse that our law enforcement community in Texas is addressing. And I think, the last piece of that is, in addition to making that requirement to show the proper worker authorization, if you are caught providing a forged government document to a law enforcement officer in the form of a CDL, you're now going to be put in jail for that. That's something that has, my biggest fear. And 2 years ago, when we passed that legislation, I went to all my states, all of my colleagues in other states, and said, we've got a problem here. Here's how we're dealing with it. But rather unfortunately, I think these drivers are going to be moving into your states very soon, and that's exactly what they've done.
One of the things that we talk about in the industry now, and the spotlight is on the English-speaking component of the reconstitution of the out-of-service criteria for English. I was at CVSA, as you know, when was that, last month or a couple months ago here in New Orleans, and man, that was the talk of the day. The timing couldn't have been better, because CVSA was meeting right at the time when that was brought out. We talked to Jamie Jones from Landline and Rick Gobble, of course, a former FMCSA head there in Tennessee, on the program this morning. But you're in Texas. One is they're in Missouri and Tennessee. So you're right there at the border where the language line is, so to speak, in other words, the border. So we have a Spanish-speaking country and an English-speaking country. So I would imagine there's going to be a hotbed of activity in terms of not just whether you can speak and understand English, but cabotage now is coming back into the spotlight. And I remember 40 years ago when cabotage was all anybody talked about after deregulation. So is there going to be a piling on there in Texas, do you think? Do you understand what I'm trying to get at here?
I do, and to an extent. Now, here's the thing. If you take the scenario that I just mentioned, we have to – Mexico's our largest partner for the country, not just the state of Texas, as y'all well know. So this is our front porch. It's not just our backyard. We have to look at that relationship, and we're going to continue to cultivate that. And that's the future of our success. We're seeing that along the border, the amount of trucks that cross every day. I mean, it is happening. But what is also happening is it is not just a deference to a Mexican national trying to get into the United States using a Mexican CDL that they've illegally obtained. This is more about other countries, other of South American countries, European countries, that are taking that scenario and coming through Mexico and buying that Mexican CDL in order to take advantage of the relationship that we have through USMCA. There's just what this presents to us, and what we continue to purport is it's an opportunity to look at the USMCA agreement, to look at the way we're issuing visas. Quite frankly, we ought to be issuing a very specific visa for truck drivers. I mean, you've applied visas that don't necessarily apply to the situations that we find ourselves in to move freight across the border, and that's what's been working. So I'm hoping that with the attention of this administration, my conversation in Austin a few weeks ago with the Secretary of Transportation, I think things are moving in the right direction, and certainly with the English proficiency, that's going to be one more thing where we can look at, pay attention to what's occurring at our border. 1,250 miles of all of the U.S.-Mexico border is in the state of Texas, and there's 1,550 total miles. So, yes, we see a lot of that, and we are the front line of defense when it comes to the situation.
Yeah, and by the way, we want to kind of give examples and anecdotes. John Esparza joins us this morning, longtime friend of the show. He's the man with the plan over at TXTA and has a lot of experience both in the private and public sectors of working with coalitions of people to help kind of get the ball down the road for transportation. I want to kind of talk about the fuel depots here for a minute to kind of give people an example, because Dave said Spanish speaking on one side, English speaking on the other. I'm actually going to disagree with Dave. I'm going to say that there's a gigantic liminal space at the border of Mexico and at the border of Texas where it's not just Spanish and English being spoken by everybody, but it's a whole bunch of other languages as well, too, as you kind of pointed out. It makes for, not confusion, but it makes for law enforcement having a lot of challenges and trucking having a lot of challenges because there are so many different players there. But can you kind of talk about the fuel depots here? I don't think there's so much going on in the world. I don't think people are aware of that and the cartels at the Texas border as well, too.
Well, this has been a subject that is very exclusive to us based on our geography. And the other piece of this, it's based on the absolute thirst for diesel that Mexico has and their inability to refine it. They have a greater capacity for or a greater demand for diesel than they can provide. So as a result, the United States becomes a very big exporter of fuel to Mexico, and to Pemex in particular. And this is necessary. This is something that has been growing over the years and over time. But as a result of that and the nefarious activity that can happen and happens with regards to commodities such as the fuel and its consumption and the buying and selling and producing of it, what you have in our state is a situation in which you are overloading Mexican trailers that are designed already to carry 120,000 pounds of fuel, but they're being overloaded at 140, 150, 160,000 pounds. And so they're allowed to come into the United States, go to the rack of where they're loading fuel, and then instead of going directly back into the closest avenue to get back over a bridge into Mexico, they're running parallel for miles, 40, 50, 60 miles plus. They're transloading at fuel depots, in which now they're skimming that with distillates. They're stolen fuel, stolen crude is being brought in from across the country, primarily in Permian Basin, and it's all being mixed on the U.S. side and then brought into Mexico. So this is what Operation Fuel Stop engaged in 4 or 6 months ago now, and we're seeing several pieces of legislation involving this issue, none of which passed. I mean, bills that would actually help promulgate the issue and bills that would actually help us defend against the issue. It's such a contentious issue, and it's a lot of intricacies to it. But the bottom line is that's what's happening currently in Texas and what we're working against.
Let me ask you another question, too, because this kind of falls into my bailiwick. How are you guys collaborating with law enforcement? I mean, and I mean federal task force, I mean state troopers, and people don't realize the front line is often the sheriffs and the local police communities. How do you guys manage to, like I said, Texas is a big place. I mean, I've always said that there are 3 capitals in the United States: Washington, D.C., Sacramento, and Austin. Because, it's the 8th largest economy is what we're talking about in the world here. 7th, if you talk to some people in Texas. How are you guys working with all of these separate players to make sure that there's a coherent strategy to really make sure that truck drivers are making that money, but also that everybody's making that money legit?
Yeah, this has been one of the biggest comprehensive efforts that hasn't really gone communicated. You have to dig through a few articles, a few edicts from the administration, but there has been a great collaboration of efforts between the federal government and local police, our state police, in stings against these fuel depots and the activities around them. A more recent article involving a sting down in South Texas involved a couple that was in Utah at the time. I mean, it is an amazing amount of organized effort that goes between both the enforcement side, but also what's behind it. The factions of the cartel have been warring for years. The reason why I mentioned earlier that truck is running parallel to the border as opposed to crossing it directly over, because when the wrong cartel is in charge on one side, then it requires them to go to other points up and down the border to cross. That's part of what's occurring. But when they all, war over fentanyl, war over the drugs that are coming across, but then they all actually are organized when it comes to the movement of fuel, that's because it is a $2.6 billion industry for them annually. So you are seeing a lot of effort currently, a lot of focus behind law enforcement community, and it is all happening, right here in our backyard.
So we do have a bill, though, in the Senate, right, from Juan Hinojosa, SB 2949, to stop the fuel smuggling at the border. That was about a month old now, I guess?
It is. That bill also failed with the end of session, and that was a very comprehensive effort to address a lot of these issues that we're seeing. And unfortunately, you have a number of bills that are being were being promoted to really act to enable some of that activity. That's the thing. You have to, you're trying to you see various communities up and down the border that are trying to increase weights for aggregate materials in particular, or what those corridors were originally intended for. Years ago when they were set up, is the movement of products, steel, produce in particular. Was told more recently that it wasn't. It was about 93 octane fuel that was being sold. Now it's just moved into this diesel industry, and because of the need for diesel in Mexico, it's changing. So we all have to make the laws change to address some of the consequences or unintended consequences that come up as a result of agreements from the past. So you're seeing that happen currently, and we saw none of those bills passed. And so when the session ended, we were back to square one, where DPS is going to work to continue to enforce on these issues, and we'll start taking up the measure to enact Chuy Hinojos's legislation once again next session, 2027 now.
John Esparza, thank you so much for being the first guest on the State of Trucking, the long-form conversation on this blitzkrieg of a show. Really appreciate you. I know a lot of people have been kind of dying to get some information on what's going on in Texas. Where can people find you before we shuffle off this radio coil with you?
Oh, come find us on texastrucking.com. We've got lots of social media platforms, and if you come chase us on all of them, we put the most important information out there the quickest on our social media.
Thank you, John. I know Dave wants to say goodbye.
Oh, absolutely, John. Thank you so much. And sorry we got so serious on your first outing here with us.
We got a little Les Paul in there, though. We got some Les Paul in there. Thank you, John.
I'm honored, guys. I hope to see y'all this summer down in Austin.
We'll do, actually. We'll see you there. Thank you, John Esparza, TXTA.